Chapter 10. Anna Sophia. When Anna Sophia walked to Union Junior High the next day, a couple of girls were waiting out front. "Anna Sophia!" shouted Lucy Tang, the petite 7th grader with short black hair. She looked annoyed, so Anna Sophia guessed Lucy had probably been shouting her name for a while and getting more and more irritated that Anna Sophia hadn't answered, as if she'd been ignoring her on purpose. Anna Sophia rolled her eyes and briefly considered the on-purpose ignoring after all. Lucy said something else Anna Sophia didn't catch, and she gave up and walked closer. "What?" asked Anna Sophia. Lucy glared. "My brother, Vin. Do you know him? He's a LARPer, and he said you know the Jersey Ghost. He said it saved you. Is that true?" "Well, kinda." The girls stood there, hugging their textbooks to their chests, mascaraed eyes blinking. Usually people didn't stare at Anna Sophia. Usually people pretended she wasn't there at all. In her better moods, when she was up for some benefit of the doubting, she supposed most people weren't trying to be mean. They probably thought it was more polite to ignore the deaf girl than to engage in a conversation that might turn awkward if she couldn't understand them. Anna Sophia glared. "What?" "The somebodies want the details," said Lucy's red-headed friend. "Tell us about it." Anna Sophia glared harder. They didn't budge. Usually 2 glares did it. People, she learned, hate awkwardness more than hatred itself. But today, these girls cared more about the Jersey Ghost than an awkward run-in with the deaf girl. So she gave in and told them about how a Squirrel girl had saved her last night, as briefly as possible, and she thought that would be the end of it. By the time she left second period pre-calculus, a slightly larger group of students was waiting outside her classroom door. "Can you tell us about it?" they asked. Anna Sophia glared. They didn't budge. She sighed and gave in quicker this time, telling the story and expanding it just a little bit more. After third period U.S. history, there wasn't just a larger group waiting. The group was waiting. The somebodies themselves. "So, what happened?" asked Heidi, twirling a lock of blonde hair around her index finger. Anna Sophia swallowed, only her throat was too dry. She definitely didn't care what the somebodies thought of her, or anybody's for that matter, and yet, all their expectant eyes on her, their gum-chewing mouths closed, their attention like a spotlight. "Well, I was in the park last night, just walking home," and she told the story, the whole story this time, excluding Doreen, of course. Doreen hadn't been there after all. It'd been a stranger with a tail and heroic intentions. As Anna Sophia spoke, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen. Her spine seemed to straighten. A crowd was gathered in the hallway, eyes on her. Usually her hearing aids turned the constant background noise of school into a fretful buzzing inside her brain. But now, silence, total rapt attention. And then she picked me up as if I weighed nothing, placed me on her shoulders and leaped. So fast, so high, for a moment I thought we were flying. The ground was a blur far below. The stars seemed close enough to grab. There in midair I asked her, "Who are you?" She smiled and said, "Who? Me? Why, I'm Squirrel Girl." Squirrel Girl, Squirrel Girl. She could see lips repeating the name with wonder and excitement. Except the somebodies. They looked at one another and shrugged. Ike, a boy with brown hair sweeping across his forehead, was talking for a bit before Anna Sophia looked at him, so she didn't catch it at all. But by the end, he maybe said, "A girl who looks like a squirrel?" Jude, a boy with even sweepier hair, said something else to the group, but by the time she'd looked at him, she'd missed too much of it to guess the rest. Yanni, the boy with the sweepiest hair, was looking right at her when he said, "Sounds kinda lame." "Lame is an obvious term," Anna Sophia muttered. "What?" asked Heidi. "Nothing," said Anna Sophia. She could feel a powerful glare coming on like some people felt the approach of a migraine. "Okay, you can go now," said Heidi. The crowd disappeared. Anna Sophia exhaled, but someone remained. Straight, dark hair almost to his shoulders. Vin Tang. His desk had been next to hers in 5th grade, or was it 6th? They'd been on the same Math Heroes team, and he used to fold origami horses and leave them on her chair. She'd been certain he'd forgotten about her, until last night when he'd call her by name. For sure, he'd forgotten about those little paper horses, but she still used one as a bookmark. He waved to get her attention. Hey, hi, he smiled, then looked at his feet and back at her again. Hey, Vin. Would you come with me? I want to show you something. He led her away from the cafeteria to the quiet back hallway by the music room. Suddenly there before her were the dozen characters who struck her in a pillory just last night. Her stomach turned cold. She started to back away. Wait, said Vin. Two others unrolled a 10-foot parchment and held it up like a banner. In fancy, inky calligraphy were the huge words, "We beggeth your forgiveness." You're sorry? Asked Anna Sophia. Vin shrugged. Yes, but we're sorry. Anna Sophia couldn't make out the last part. She shook her head. You're sorry what? We're sorry, Vin said, then fingerspelled the word medievally. Anna Sophia couldn't help smiling. Vin smiled back. And she understood both that he was aware that the LARPer stuff could get a little silly and that he still loved it. She could respect that. You, fair Anna Sophia, are her pard, and we honor you, said the Baron, bowing. He looked much skinnier without his cape and all. I'm her pard? Anna Sophia asked, wrinkling her nose. How did that even become a thing? No, bard, said the Baron. You tell her story. What power you hold. He lifted a fist to the ceiling and shook it as if consumed with the idea of fabulous bardish power. She is fierce and cunning, and we swear we will follow no other liege, but... He raised an eyebrow, waiting for Sophia's permission to name her. Squirrel Girl, said Anna Sophia. They all nodded, mumbling things to one another that she didn't catch, but their faces seemed pleased. Please, Lady Anna Sophia, gift her this from us. Vin handed Anna Sophia a leather belt. It looked handcrafted and resembled the ones in their LARPer costumes, but this had several utility pouches attached all the way around, and he'd worked images of acorns into the leather. You know what? She's gonna love this, Anna Sophia had an idea. I wish you had your swords. In an instant, one pulled a sword out of her duffel bag and handed it to her. Anna Sophia could see now that the blade was dull, though it was heavy. A prop more than a weapon, but a prop that would definitely clunk someone pretty hard on the head. Kneel, Anna Sophia said grandly. All dozen dropped gratefully to a knee. One by one, she tapped their shoulders with a sword tip. I dub you, each of you, a Squirrel Scout, the very first Squirrel Scouts, sworn to uphold justice, defend the weak, inspire the strong, and be valiant servants to our hero, Squirrel Girl. They lifted their fists into the air and repeated, Squirrel Girl. Anna Sophia tried very hard not to laugh out loud, and yet at the same time she almost felt like crying, like happy crying. Was that a thing? Because Anna Sophia was starting to believe that might be a thing. This thing, all things, frankly, had been easier before Doreen, when Shady Oaks was a hopeless mess and there was nothing ever to look forward to. Hope was confusing as this super long confusing math equation that I can't read. And this is for you or whatever, said Vin. He placed something in her hand and hurried away. It was an origami unicorn pressed into super thin leather. Anna Sophia left the LARPers in rapture over their new callings as Squirrel Scouts and hurried to the cafeteria. She checked her pocket 3 times to make sure the leather unicorn hadn't fallen out. There you are, said Doreen, waiting by the doors. Everyone's talking about... Anna Sophia made a sign Doreen hadn't seen before. Her left hand formed the sign for an S, a fist with a thumb across the fingers. Her right hand made a G, the index finger pointing. She swept the G hand away from the S hand, almost as if it were a long, beautiful tail flowing behind a very specific girl. Wait, what was that? Said Doreen. The last sign. Anna Sophia fingerspelled Squirrel Girl. This? Doreen swept the G away from the S. This means me? Her mouth hung open, her eyes wide and glinty. She did the sign again, and then she laughed. What's funny? Anna Sophia asked, tensing for Doreen to say something ignorant about her signing or her deafness. You made up a sign for me? Doreen signed. You made up a sign for Squirrel Girl, as if she were a real person. Doreen picked Anna Sophia up in a super-powered hug and spun around. Anna Sophia's stomach seemed to follow a second later, and she almost feared Doreen was lifting her to the ceiling. Anna Sophia glanced into the cafeteria to see if anyone had noticed how easily Doreen had picked her up. But everyone was busy stuffing their faces with sandwiches and jabbering about Squirrel Girl, probably. Anna Sophia couldn't help but smile. Her cheeks protested. They were so out of practice, but she insisted. Smile and act it. So, what are you going to do tonight? Anna Sophia signed when Doreen had put her down. Walk the neighborhood? Catch bad guys? Audition for the Avengers? Save the world? Well, Doreen grimaced, actually, I'm grounded. I told my mom what I did, and I guess I can't be Squirrel Girl anymore. Doreen tried to smile like it was no big deal, but her chin betrayed her, quivering. And just like that, Anna Sophia's weird, uncomfortable, but somehow sparkly and alluring new bubble of hope popped. You can't, she said. Tail tucked away forever, said Doreen. But thanks for making me feel like her, for a few days anyway. I really felt like her. That was unbelievably cool. They sat at their usual table and ate in silence. Doreen picked through her trail mix, only eating the macadamia nuts, and not even bothering with her second and third sandwiches. Sometimes she adjusted in her seat as if her tail were aching. Mike joined them, glowering over his home lunch, a bag of chips, a sleeve of cookies, and a candy bar. Without even looking at Doreen and Anna Sophia, he began grumbling. Anna Sophia was able to catch some of what he said, and knowing Mike, was able to feel the rest. Everybody's talking about that idiotic Jersey ghost thing, he said. Clearly not a ghost. Stupid to even call it that. Probably it's just some freak who was born with a tail. What kind of a freak has a tail anyway? Some attention-hungry loner messing with other people's lives? This is the most annoying day ever. If I have to hear one more person gush about whatever thing that freak really is, I'm going to explode. The freak better not show up again. Doreen sighed, as if to say, no need to worry about that now. Mike had been sitting at Anna Sophia's table since last year. He rarely spoke except to complain about how awful everything was, and honestly, she never really disagreed with him. Then entered Doreen, bursting like a fireball of optimism. Only now that fireball seemed extinguished. Maybe Mike had things right after all. Maybe there really was no point to anything. Anna Sophia pulled her notebook out of her bag. The purple cover was fading and bent from overuse, the edges of the paper soft as tissues. She flipped through the notes she'd been taking for the past 2 years, again scanning for a pattern. Maybe she would postpone giving up. Maybe it was time to go hardcore detective.